Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name's not Gus Hossain, I'm Caitlin, and I'm PI's campaigns coordinator. Hi! This week, we're talking about education technology. If you've listened to the podcast for a long time, you'll know this is the topic I am low-key obsessed with and bring up whenever I have the opportunity. Luckily for me, I guess luckily for him as well, Gus is on holiday this week, so I'm going to get to talk to Jen Persson, who is the Executive Director of Defend Digital Me, about the unique environment in England specifically of how children's data gets extracted, gets used and gets reshared in the UK educational environment, both by the Department for Education, often called the DFE by all the cool UK kids using the cool UK slang, but also by edtech companies that are coming into these really sensitive and interesting spaces to try and make a load of money. Let's just jump right into this conversation because I'm really excited to have it.
Hello, thank you for having me. So I'm Jen Persson, Director of Defend Digital Me. Defend Digital Me was set up a decade ago in the UK to look at children's and learners' education data. So we campaign for safe, fair and transparent data across the education sector in England in particular, but we now say also and beyond, because education data is increasingly used as a go-to source for lots of, whether it's government departments or ed tech or other commercial types of users, to source information about children or indeed adults from when they were children. We're looking really at how those information can be used across education sector and also the rest of the public sector. And we started out as a single issue looking at how the UK government used national pupil records. That is all the information that's collected about children and learners when they start school, and is kept on a rolling basis and updated until about age 25, and then is retained forever about their course of their education and how that database was being used without full transparency, without users and learners really knowing what and where was being collected and what it was used for and the sorts of repurposing it was going to. And we're still looking at getting improvements in how those data are cared for, looked after, managed, and importantly, trying to get changes in what people are told about that data and to give them controls over its use through an opt-in mechanism.
What caught your eye, I guess, about the National Pupil Record and the National Pupil Database in the UK that led to Defend Digital Me?
So more importantly, there were lots of other people working across civil society about whom we were not familiar. I was not familiar until groups and individuals got together, and there was a group called Med Confidential that campaigned around the collection of GP medical records about all of us across the NHS. And they did incredible work to raise awareness in people like me who knew nothing about how the state would collect information and personal data about all of us. And so that raised my awareness of how that kind of information was being used, in particular in the health sector, and then drew my attention to how it was being used in other sectors. I was a mother, I still am, of 3 children at the time who were then in school and really had no idea about what was collected and where it went. And it surprised and shocked me, and still continues to do, about what level of sort of sensitive and very intrusive data is collected on an individual level about children. And really trying to get that information out to parents and to families and to everyone, really, because that data is kept forever. It affects people in England in particular up to about the age of 48. Anyone who's been in state education has a record, and it's been given away to all sorts of third parties. And what particularly shocked me at that time was in sort of 2012, 2013, was it being given to journalists, to charities, think tanks, commercial companies, including a company that, for example, was given identifiable pupil level information to create heat maps that were used for estate agents mapping where children came from and where they went to school. So there were all sorts of reasons this data is collected for your everyday direct education but I didn't realize it even left school on a named basis at all. So I think the surprise of that really caught me out, and I wanted to make sure there was that level of understanding that I was starting to get available to other people. And so we started with pupil data and then really working through how the rest of that information was being sent across the rest of the education sector and then out into the public sector and to other places. We started to also look at other areas, including, for example, commercial uses of data. So ed tech, that's technology companies that children use in the course of an education, or the administrative systems that schools are using about children. And also then looking at sort of the policing and home office type reuses of the same sorts of data that are going into education, but coming out and going to other bodies.
Has a lot changed in the last decade, or is it times change, but broadly things stay the same?
It's a great question. I think there's a really good reference point, which actually goes back 25 years, which is the Database State report that was published by leading academics. And that tackled a number of databases that the UK government was in the process of, or perhaps starting or had established 25 years ago. And this really included primarily sort of population-wide or sectors of population-wide data. And what I think has changed is now the scale of those, of course, where databases that were about a population at a point in time and have now been kept forever are now 25 years old. And if those records go back any length of time, they are really, really long, what they call longitudinal records. And the use cases of the data have grown. And as people say, if you build it, they will come. Those databases were built initially, many of them without the safeguards and protective oversight that should have been in place for the sensitivity in particular for many of the data. And also what's changed perhaps is some of the infrastructure and the technological capabilities that existed 25 years ago have really been expanded on, as well as the malicious types of uses that they can be put to, because we're now all far more connected. The internet, the online activities, that data now don't just sit in a database, but can be shared at speed and scale with a couple of clicks of a button, means that the initial risks that I think they scoped back then have really materialized. And a lot of those uses that we now see that civil society warned of, for example, back in 2002, the warnings from civil society at that point were, if you start collecting named pupil data, what could be done with it? And the government ministers, of course, said at the time, we're not interested in using this at named level. We only want to be able to use it to join up records. And that will give us better research data. And we'll then use that research data to better the system and improve the lives and the delivery of education for everybody in the system. Fast forward 10 years and different governments started using it for immigration enforcement, not to improve the lives of individuals, but actually chase down families or people that they felt were in breach of their terms and conditions in terms of migration and immigration laws. And that was something that was simply never discussed at the time the data started to be collected. Last year, the same data set starts to be used for welfare benefit fraud detection. And again, this might have, worthy reasons for that sort of, pursuit of fraud. But I think the question is, where is both the legal and the moral duties to examine why was that data collected in the first place? And if it's collected about children who go to school in order to fulfill their right to education, it's really important that those data are kept safe for those purposes. And particularly right now, where governments are concerned in the wake of COVID that more and more children are perhaps being homeschooled or out of school, that bond of trust between a family and the school is really important to maintain. And so for those families, or for those with undocumented, migration status, you pose that risk that then the attending a school is no longer seen as a benefit to the child, but potentially a risk to the family. And I think you jeopardize the very purpose for why the information was collected in the first place, which is to fulfill the right of the child to education. And we seem to have lost sight of that. And I think increasingly that is probably the thing that has changed most, is simply the idea that people warned of 25 years ago and 10 years ago, and every time new databases and new things get expanded, which is if there is potential for scope creep, it will happen. And, if we're really genuinely looking at better, good use of safe data, we need to be focused more on data minimization, which seems to have been, of course, completely disbanded by now the big push for more data about everything, about everywhere, all of the time, in order to build artificial intelligence and AI technology.
Broadly, if you're a child going to school, what data is being collected? And maybe it makes sense to chunk it. So like before you start school, what data has already been collected about you by the state?
So in England, it's very different from even Wales and Scotland or Northern Ireland in the UK, because education is a devolved matter. That means the laws around education are different. And when a child has to start compulsory school and when they can leave, for example, has different ages. But if we were to focus only on England, there are particular families and children who have a greater contact rate with the state than others. And so, for example, where there are children about whom there are considered to be safeguarding risks or threats to children, there is a lot of data collected already about a child, even potentially pre-birth. And those data sets, like the children in need data, is collected by local authorities for the very direct purposes of the care of a child. And that data, in addition, then already goes to the Department for Education on an individual basis. So you can start very, very young in some circumstances. In normal circumstances, preschool, that would be for the early years, and preschool, so from roughly 2 to 5, and children that attend any state funded, so where there is public taxpayer money going into institutions and places for preschool, those places and information about the child that fills them will be collected already. So you can have a already pretty rich, detailed record of a child, even from age 2 in nursery. And then at age 5 is really where in education it starts for everybody, because that's the age of which children must be, if they are going to go into state education rather than choose elective home education, for example, they must be in state education in the term of their birth, of their 5th birthday. And so really that then starts off a whole set of statutory tests and collection about assessment. It's about a child's progress. So you've got the baseline test, which is as soon as a child enters the school, to do sort of assessments around motor skills and behavior and initial sort of reading and responses to models and patterns and those sorts of things. That's done now on an iPad, for example, by staff. And those test scores are already collected, at age 5. And then you've got the progressive tests that go through different sort of levels of assessment and progression at, age 8, 9, 10 and 11 again, which are called the SATs, key stage tests in the UK. And again, then as children go into secondary school, of course, all the statutory testing that's around exams. So GCSEs, A-levels, BTECs, any of the other types of exams that are offered to young learners around the age of 16 and 18 again before going to university. So that's a kind of assessment and progression of education that you might expect to be collected. What always surprises me is it's at pupil level, that it's on your named record. So your score of how you did in a multiplications times tables test at age 8 is collected and kept. And what's sort of concerning is there's also all the reasons for not taking the test. And that's the kind of data that you start to think, this isn't necessarily only going to be used for education purposes, but if it says newly arrived to the system, i.e. you're likely to be of an uncertain migration status, those sorts of things start coming in where it isn't anymore just about your learning and progress, but starts to be about the characteristic of a child. And for every child that has a state education place, there is a census taken every term. So that means 3 times a year. And the schools don't ask the parents for the information, but it comes directly from the schools through local authorities or directly to the Department for Education, depending on which type of school you're in. And that is then sent to collect things like, the full name, date of birth, home address, those sorts of contact details, the geolocation of your property, and then going through things like your characteristics, so ethnicity, special educational needs, so types of hearing impairments, sight impairments, visual impairments, anything to do with mental and physical health. There's a whole range of factors recorded there in quite a lot of detail. And then going through to things like whether you're in a military family, for example, or adopted from care, or again, going back to those children in need flags. So there's quite sensitive characteristics about the individual that also give infer information about a family. And then it touches things like indicators of living in poverty or socioeconomic disadvantage. So we call that free school meals indicators. And we have about a quarter of children, receive that flag at some point in their school lifetime at the moment in the UK, because 1 in 4 children is living in poverty. And so we've got a lot of sort of a mix of information that's collected throughout every term. So that's collected about 50 times across a child's lifetime. And that, together with the assessment data, goes into the National Pupil Record. And then, interestingly, it's joined up with lots of other data that comes from lots of other sources. So there's about 25 different collections that go on throughout a child's lifetime across different types of census, and they all get linked up into what is then this melting pot, the National Pupil Database. And then in parallel, there's an individual learner record, which is about other alternative types of education, so further education, technical colleges, and all that information is then now being linked to welfare data and tax records, so HMRC data. And that surprised me again. We don't know that our education records now are being linked to our first jobs and our first salaries and what type of education you had. And I think what's really interesting, because there's a lot of content there, is what is it telling government? Why is it being collected? And I think one of the questions that's perhaps changing is who is politically using that and benefiting from it. And the sense I have is that increasingly everything is seen as a cost, and we are measuring what is the cost of something is then being sort of used as a proxy for what is the value of something. And I think there's a great risk that we start seeing government policy based on what type of education is seen of value and who is seen as having value to the UK economy. And you start to then say, well, should these children, should these learners with these types of characteristics or these types of disabilities be able to go into these types of education? Or will you start to see it shape public policy of being more restrictive about access to higher education, for example, or to different types of grants or different types of welfare support that would dissuade certain people from going into education, which might be seen as a cost to the system and is now being measured in a return to the economy in terms of your tax receipts to the government. All of this that you don't see going on behind the scenes when you just think you send your children to school.
So they're recording a huge amount of information, some of which is, fair to say, been traditionally quite dubious. Like, in how much trouble have the DfE gotten, let's say, for their handling of this data and the accuracy or the inputs?
There's been some challenges, and we've been successful in some challenges, but I would say overall, unfortunately, the direction of travel is still to collect more data, to use it for more things, and to do it with less transparency. And so where there have been challenges, for example, was around the expansion of the school census in 2016, where we first saw that there was information going from the Department for Education to the Home Office for Immigration Enforcement. And at the same time, the Department for Education was about to collect nationality and country of birth from children in schools. And that raised flags to a whole great array of people working across civil society and charities and with young people and children who were really concerned that this could be misused potentially for migration sort of crackdowns that had been promised by several Home Office ministers over the previous sort of 5 years that I was really unfamiliar with. And a huge number of anti-racism, pro-migrants' rights, supportive youth workers and teachers across the education sector came together and said, we're really concerned about this. And it was exactly then at the time that we discovered not only were their concerns justified, but actually they were already being realised, that there was an agreement that was already in place, that was live, that nobody knew about, had never been discussed in Parliament, that showed that the Department of Education was sharing data on a monthly basis with the Home Office. And it was for the purposes, amongst many others, of furthering what was called the hostile environment. So to make it harder for people who wanted to live here of uncertain or undocumented migrant status, or to proceed against, criminal proceedings against people who'd overstayed visas and things. And so the department did get a lot of scrutiny around that, as particularly through members of parliamentarians, particularly in the House of Lords. But unfortunately, it didn't stop more than the new collection. So we were able to persuade government, and that was thanks to the collaborative work of many, many campaigners who formed an umbrella organisation against Borders of Children and a coalition of over 20 groups. And teachers and parents collectively refused to provide 25% of that return. And so the quality of the data was therefore going to be no good for whatever purposes, nefarious or otherwise, the Department for Education had claimed it would be used for. And so they were able to get that data stopped being collected. But unfortunately, the department carried on with the monthly shares of other data, which they carry on today. The quality of data, I think, is a whole different issue. Again, if we start to think about AI, ethnicity is a well-known example. Just last week, we found a local authority with a policy that directed schools that if families had chosen not to provide ethnicity, which is their legal and lawful right, then it was directing the local authority to fill it in, to tell the schools to basically go ahead and make it up. It's one of those matters that you think, I don't see an effect on me when my child goes to school of whether their ethnicity is accurate or not. But what's it doing if we start to use that information perhaps in some sort of other third-party systems? So we don't know where it's gone because the Department for Education has handed it out as raw data for years. So you don't have any control over where it's gone once it's been given out. Is it now with insurance companies? Is it now with other places that you wouldn't know that could be using it to make decisions about you as an adult? And I think that's pretty concerning. And those sorts of things, when they do start to matter, they shape a whole narrative, what people perceive about their society, what they perceive then the direction of travel of society. And that, I think, we're seeing the real effects of those sorts of conversations and direction of travel, even, to undermine the sort of perception of how society is made up and what impact immigration has on society and even, democracy itself.
Assuming that nothing changes in terms of kind of the governmental vibe and the legislative kind of environment, where do you think things, if they continue on this trend, are heading? And what do you think the kind of biggest dangers of the next few years, but then on a much longer time frame are?
Well, I'd love to think about what good would look like. What would be a really wise and sensible use of information that is A, collected today, or B, has been retained over a long time, and how does it compare with what is? There are good models of what's called safe data management. So particularly around the UK, it's called the 5 Safes model, looking at data being retained in ways that is minimal or is minimized and is also changed in ways that perhaps is less identifying and can be therefore more secure as well. And as the methods that are looking at encryption and how it might be stored. And then you look at how you don't distribute it, as they have done and are still doing for some use cases, to the recipients of data. They're not receiving what we used to call raw data, just unprotected data as it is and identifying in its accessible format. But they would have to go to a setting and access the information there. So instead of being sent the data, they would use it in a safe setting. And you can also make the data only, distributed to people that are somehow accredited or somehow trained or have ethics reviews and oversight, rather than just sending out raw to, the Telegraph or BBC Newsnight or other journalists that received it in 2012 without those sorts of oversights or perhaps training in the way that you might consider necessary for accredited researchers. And I think sort of some of those directions of travel would be good. And we went in some of those better ways of looking at data, I think, because of regulation that came under the General Data Protection Regulation in 2018. Unfortunately, the Department for Education didn't then stop those unsafe uses as well. So they now manage both processes in parallel. I think what's concerning is there is so much data now that people have poor oversight even within the departments. And it was a criticism of the audit that there was no proper record keeping. There was no ROPA, record of processing activities. And it's that kind of competing directions of travel I think we've got at the moment. We really have to ask ourselves, I think, and I say we, this is one of the challenges. Who do you mean by we? Who gets a say in this? Is this, a few narrow people making policy in a department? Is it a government? Does the Cabinet Office even know that probably half of them have their own records and this data being given away to third parties and reused commercially because a lot of them are under 50 now and state educated? Is there actually awareness of who we is that are making these decisions? And I think that would be perhaps the biggest potential for a direction of travel that would be better, is if people actually knew, if the government had the guts to really make a wise, informed policy choice, which would be built on all the findings of lots of committees and reports and recommendations that have been written over the last decade, which say you need to tell people. It's not just the law that you need to tell people, but this is good practice. You'd actually get better data out of it. Perhaps some people would choose not to provide everything that you currently collect, but really, would that be such a bad thing? Is everything that's collected right now used? And we would argue, we know it's not. We know there's lots of data collected that's not used for anything. And potentially there's lots of data collected that shouldn't be used. So if we looked at, for example, equality monitoring data, sexual orientation, religion, disabilities is being collected when young people start the transition between secondary school and higher education and apply to university. And that's been collected by the admissions processes for these organisations that are involved in access to higher education in England. And they don't have an adequate process for telling students this is what happens, this information and where it goes. And so now it's collected on a named basis. And you might think that if you were to state your sexual orientation as part of equality monitoring quite happily in the UK, that it would be kept as a statistic. But in fact, in higher education, it's been added then back into the Department for Education and back into that national pupil record, which has your name on it. And so sexual orientation, religion and disabilities are all now kept as equality monitoring data on a named basis forever at the Department for Education. And it's been kept by various funding bodies and other higher education authorities as well. And that is the kind of data where I start to think, what's the direction of travel for that? If we look at the US right now, we see lots of big tech companies and others disavowing all their diversity and equality work and scrapping their sort of commitments to accountability and transparency and equality. And I think we look at that kind of data and think, what if? What if that data is sitting around on a named basis and there is a new government that doesn't fancy the look of a particular sexual orientation or agree with a particular religion? How might that information be used? So I think the big thing we need to really consider is, what the risks are, is actually look at the realities of the infrastructure and the checks and balances we've got in place and think, are they enough? Are they sufficient? And are they going to be robust to potential misuse that you might not want to dream of today, but is a potential reality soon? And so you need to build your infrastructure to manage those risks. And I don't think we have those safeguards in place yet. So we have two, different paths to possibly take. And I think with the UK government being really focused on economic growth and really pushing a big agenda around AI into the UK economy and UK sort of technology as a leading field, I think we need to think, what is the data we've got? Is it good quality? Are we looking at this sort of poor quality data? Could we improve it by giving it back or giving access back to the people it comes from and asking them to have access to that data and make it accurate and check it and be able to give updates, on a regular basis? Would we potentially have a slightly smaller data set, but it might be far better quality and more accurate? Could we then, look at that sort of safe infrastructure of how it's being used and do away with the parallel, weak, risky infrastructures and make sure we've got sort of the right checks and balances in place? And, we've got a lot of work to do in that field still. I think we need to look at two things that the Department for Education is looking at for the future. One is the automated decision-making and AI sector. And they're talking about what's called a content store with a pretty loose description right now of what might be in it. But there's already clear direction of travel around consultation potentially to come around the reuse of pupil, so learners' content. That might be coming from their ed tech, everyday technology applications. And when we think about that, we haven't talked much about those commercial applications, but those are 24/7 from when a child crosses the playground on CCTV, using the school's information management system, logs data about them. They could be using a number of different apps, any time of the day, whether it's doing sort of quizzes or, maths checks, or using an AI assisted tool for prompting questions and study. Very, very commonly used now in the UK, which might shock people from other countries as it's not as widespread and weekly overseen as it is here in the UK, but we use biometrics in the canteens often to use cashless payment systems and fingerprints, and even growing facial recognition being used by schools. We don't really know all of those companies that are operating in schools and that sort of interaction between the data that's being stored locally, that's going then to companies, and whether it's being used to train that sort of biometric and particularly facial recognition tools. And they could be using a number of different platforms, from Google to Microsoft to various others. And all of these companies, sort of coming in to education, many of whom came from business that weren't really designed for educational purposes at all, on top of apps that look at, things like behavior control. So they're doing things like monitoring points that teachers can award a child in a class for good or bad behavior. And those, I think, have a really, in some ways, quite nasty approach sometimes to their pedagogy. They work on a sort of shaming basis. If you do something bad, you get a behavior point, and then it might play a sound in front of your classmates and embarrass you that you got a bad point. Or you get your points totaled up at the end of a week or end of a month, and on a chart that gets projected up on a wall. And again, it's sort of this name and shame children. I think these kinds of ed techs and technologies we're not thinking enough about in terms of how they shape a child and how you influence a child's not only cognitive but social and mental well-being, and what it's really doing to our children to be sort of governed by these rank and spank systems that don't have oversight, that don't have any standards, that don't have any quality control, that we don't know if there's proven efficacy. And that is something the Department for Education has started to talk about and is looking at an ed tech evidence base and panel, although there's no openness at the moment about how that panel might be chosen. We hope we'll be involved in that. So sort of looking at that sort of sector and then saying, right, the Department for Education has a plan that might involve ed tech as well as then everything we talked about earlier. So whether it's pupil data coming out of your everyday education or any of the exams data, exams that you've written and exam content, and all of that might be up for grabs to turn into AI developers' content. And they're not really discussing openly right now the sort of data protection implications. Apparently, some seem to think, certainly the AI company mainly involved, as a spokesperson has told me, they don't think the data protection angle is a problem, which surprised me. But the piece they think is a problem is IP, the rights of copyright holders. And this opens up a whole new sort of debate that's never been really in the UK education system yet, which is, children as rights holders of creative content producers, and also, of course, teachers. And certainly, I think for learners, there's certainly no understanding at all that we somehow become a, cash cow for AI development companies to somehow now mine the very essence of what we do on an everyday basis in education. I think it would almost be laughable, except that it's very real and those discussions are happening, and that will be going over the next sort of 6 months. And while there's been lots of criticism of it from the media and creative industries, there's been nothing from the education sector yet. And we really need to engage with that far better. So you've got that sort of aspect of what's going on. Thinking about perhaps, those that are opposed to privatization in the UK might have called it, in sort of Margaret Thatcher's years and that sort of decade, we sold off the family silver. And it now seems like we've got nothing else left to sell but our children. And that really concerns me. And then going into the even more core of their beings is looking at genomics and that link between education and health. And the Department for Education published last August, to their credit, a study of what might be the implications of commercial genomic companies and information around genomics that parents or families or communities might have or others might have access to, and how that might influence education and the delivery of education in the future. And I think if we don't grapple with that, it's easy to laugh it off and think as somehow that's a Gattaca style model of the future that could be determining which children get to achieve which type of education and where they're permitted to fulfill their full development and thrive into adulthood and become a part of society that they choose to be. And it might be determined for you if we start to see that kind of information being used in ways that has never been intended, and that many would argue it's not fit for purpose, which is some sort of determinism of whether your risk factors are somehow worth paying any attention to when it comes to education. And I think many would say no. And I think we need to be very, very alert to the fact that when we think of what do we want for the direction of education is made up of lots of different competing communities and individuals and ideas. And that idea of how you might use data that's been collected about you from birth, that was perhaps collected for your health purposes from your heel prick test as a child when you were born, is now somehow ending up as research data, which could be extended, to be consented somehow by others on your behalf to be used for other purposes. And that somehow that could then be some sort of predeterminant of your future, I think is not beyond the realms of reality that some believe in, and they think that is the best thing for society. So I think we're at a really interesting time, I say interesting loosely, that really needs attention for people who want to stand up for things like, human rights and democracy and the rule of law, to say this matters to me right now. What direction of travel we take really matters, and what kind of society and future of society will we live in, not just this year and the next 5 years, but 10 years and beyond. And we're really going to shape that, I think, with all this big data that we've collected about children and education. And it's really going across all sorts of companies and third parties, and is pretty much, all behind closed doors and we don't know about. So I think we need much more oversight, but we also need to democratize it. We need to understand what's collected about us, who knows what about me, and which people get to control that should really be coming back to the people that it comes from, you and me and our children.
Literally me, having been to a state school in the UK and being under 48. Yeah, that's disturbing to think about. Might be worthy of a data subject access request.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great idea. You can make one. Anyone can make one. It's free. The Department for Education has its process on a website. Look up Department for Education, a subject access request. How do I access information about me? It's a bit of a convoluted process. It's not really suitable for children, but you can go and it's free and they will provide you a record, and you'll be as amazed as I was to find that they have your equality monitoring data recorded against your university modules. They even know which modules of your university course you took. And it's an incredible level of detail going back to 1996 on an unnamed basis and 2002 on a named basis. So anyone that's been in state education since 2002, you'll have a named record there.
Wonderful. Is there anything you wanted to talk about that you didn't get a chance to talk about?
There's loads of things, like age assurance and age verification. Safety tech is a big thing for us, obviously. We're doing a lot of work with Council of Europe and a team right now on AI literacy. And it's been really, really eye-opening, because the more we've done on AI literacy, it's a terrible term, but, everybody just has to use it. You realise this really is about managing who owns the future of your education system. Is it going to be owned by big tech companies? And, I didn't mention, but the business model of a lot of ed tech companies depends on the reuse of data in some format or other. And it's not necessarily selling the data. People often get hung up on that, but it's actually being able to use the information that parents' contact details, for example, within an app, to then market them a add-on product or an ad-free version. So your child might be using a quiz app, and now you get an email from the app saying your child, uses this. Would you like them to have an upgrade? And they can get an ad-free version. And you then have this sort of two-tier system being encouraged across the sector, which is ostensibly free because it's free to schools. But then you start having this sort of behind the scenes payment systems, or the parent who contacted us saying they didn't know what to do because they were using an app for encouraging their reading at home. And they'd been told by school they had to use this app with their son. And they said the trouble is there's Disney ads on it. And he seems to be watching more Disney ads than his time spent, improving his reading, because he's really distracted. He's really easily distracted. And so some of these systems might not bother some people that much, but it really is detrimental to others. And I think you end up with this unseen discrimination and commercial exploitation that is not equitable. And what's fascinating is a lot of those packages that come out of big tech companies were designed for industry. They were designed for efficiency, productivity, measuring numbers, measuring output, measuring anything that was measurable. And that's not necessarily what schools' systems were about. But it has driven that kind of mentality around what's the infrastructure of education and how is it actually shaping the education that is delivered. And so now it's very normal for students to have to go onto a Google Classroom and download their homework and upload a shared document or a PowerPoint. But the way of learning is not necessarily a good thing to be driven by the tool that you have to use. And I think that's the risk that we end up with. A lot of these systems now are driving how education is delivered rather than looking at what's, the best sort of quality educational outcome. And what really concerns me is this kind of idea that we've just handed over without any scrutiny the delivery of education to a variety of tech companies, and their values and their methodology and their look and feel and requirements of dexterity or concentration or how they expect you to interact with the system are somehow now the norm for, if you want to get your education, this is what you have to be able to do. And that's new. And I think we haven't really scrutinized any of that. We've just kind of slipped into it. And so you'll end up with, I think, if we're not careful, the same sort of challenges in a few years with the education system, and now seeing back to social media.
Well, countries ban the use of phones in schools. Like Brazil has just passed a big law saying, phones in a school aren't going to be allowed or whatever, which is fine, which is lovely, sure. But to do that at the same time as massively expanding the digital devices that you're spending loads and loads of time looking at and playing with at school, as if it's substantively different, just seems wrong, especially when they're designed by the same companies designing social media apps on the same basis that are reusing the data to then may potentially retarget you on the social media app. Like, the cognitive dissonance is quite confusing.
And it also means it's all that knowledge about who knows what about the education system. So who knows what about you is one thing, but also who knows what about your overall holistic picture of education. And so we end up with dashboards being sold in these products which don't necessarily talk to each other. Now, a lot of companies are starting to consider interoperability, and they want to share data across the different systems, which will have a whole new myriad of questions around privacy and data sharing. But the idea is that a teacher can then see across a number of different apps and platforms how a child is, according to these systems, methods of what counts and what's worth measuring, is somehow being datafied and being ranked and spanked, as we call it, across their classroom of who's in what sort of position in terms of achievement. And you get this sort of datafication of the learning path and that profiling of children, sort of building up their achievement over time. I think it's another aspect of particularly the UK education where we use a lot of these tools that perhaps doesn't exist elsewhere, because you're then setting, I think, unconsciously expectations of teachers who you hope have the good professional training to really understand how these tools work and their flaws and their risks. But I suspect most don't, because there's no data protection or data digital training as standard in UK teacher education, teacher training. And so the concern is that everything's taken at face value, and they don't necessarily understand what these data boards are telling them, and misread or, only have the time to read it in a very limited way. And I think then we're potentially pigeonholing children into pathways that say, we expect the outcome to be X over this period of time, given your previous performance. And somehow, again, you're sort of putting this predictive risk analysis based on scoring and profiling onto children, which is based on something that isn't linear, which is children's progression in education. And it's provably that, progression and learning is not linear. And yet we're making everything sort of flattened and normed. And you want to look for outliers, and anything that jumps up out as a norm outside of the curve is somehow problematic, when actually it might just never have been designed to look like that to start with. A child who was 10 recently said to me, I'm meant to be achieving these scores, and I was told that I was above average. Well, who told me I should ever want to be average? And I thought it was a very smart thing for a sort of 10-year-old to be coming out with. He was already realizing that there was this sort of expectation of norm and average. And if you were somehow different, you stood out from it because of what data expectations were telling the teacher. And it's shifting, I think, that sort of relationship between how children perceive themselves and their relationship with the teacher, which is going to be even more important, probably affected by AI, where we start to lose control and agency and autonomy of what teachers teach and how they understand what they taught and how they measure what was taught, and are able to, look into black box systems and say, I understand why the system measured you that way, and I agree or disagree. Even being able to overrule an automated scoring or point system. And especially when they make mistakes, that you go to systems and you think, no, the maths is wrong. It's got it wrong. And there's no way of children, apart from throwing a tantrum, when they're doing their homework and super frustrated because they can't put the right answer in and they know they've got it right. There's no recourse for these things usually on the system.
But it's not like the UK doesn't have a massive and famous example of an algorithm doing predictive, stuff incredibly badly. It's not like there was a huge scandal of all the grades, getting up. And then a lot of AI systems are non-deterministic, and we've got research that we're working on at the moment which shows if you put the exact same things into some recruitment AIs, you get different results out, because that's kind of how they're supposed to function. But the idea that you can just apply that to education with systems that hallucinate completely random nonsense, that lie, like lie is the wrong word because it implies, some kind of decision-making capacity, but it's just really, really weird.
There's not enough critical analysis of it. And yet, to you, to me, to lots of people who'll be listening, I think it's so obvious. And yet, you think in policymakers, why is it not? And I think that's something we have to really get to grips with, is this sort of dual messaging that comes from different sources, and who is the source of truth and who is the source of evidence. And if it is driven by companies and their marketing, and that ties in better to what a policymaker wants to deliver in terms of cost cutting, for example, then without evidence to the contrary, you might well buy into it. And things that are perhaps, less provable in terms of obvious risks and harms are really challenging to challenge and to say, why should we do this? And sometimes the answer comes back, well, why should we not? We haven't yet seen the harms. And of course, we try and operate in, let's avoid the harms rather than have to prove that they happened. But I think you go back to that, National Pupil Database and say, well, look, 2002, you said you collect names and nothing would happen. 10 years later, you changed that policy. A different government came and changed that policy. And there is harm in terms of immigration enforcement and misuse, and now targeting people on an operational basis. And I think we do have growing evidence of harms. And I think it's a sad sort of state of affairs that it seems to be seen as an either or, as a playoff. Somehow you're either pro-tech or pro-privacy. You're somehow, pro-innovation and growth or pro-privacy, and you can't be both. And I think people that really have a sensible understanding of all this see that privacy is underpinning all of these good practices. And it's not just a human right for individuals, but for communities and collectives and society to really understand that power imbalance between all those companies we're talking about, designing their systems with their values and their systems design and sort of black box algorithmic decision making that, as you say, poor choice of words in terms of decision making, but the outcomes that happen for the person using the system that are somehow beyond your control. I think this is a thing that we don't get a chance to discuss with policymakers because they're always in such a hurry and they need to make laws and they need to be seen to be doing the right thing all the time. And you actually need policymakers to be able to step back and say, what's our vision of good? What is it that we really want to deliver? And it's not about technology. It's about what's the purpose of education? Like, why do we even educate society? And if your model, as it is increasingly across many, Western and global North countries it's about productivity, it's about output, it's about producing workers for the system. And those workers will then create wealth, and they will return that wealth in taxation to the government and to the state. And we will somehow, have a productive society because we are wealthier than our predecessors. I think the evidence right now is pointing to the decades of that system really isn't working right now. And if anything, the increased pace of technology through using more AI across more types of systems and more types of sectors, and especially the public sector, will only enhance that. I think people have really lost the sense of, I'm not in control of my everyday life anymore. I don't feel like I get a say, and I don't know what's going to happen, and I can't use this system, or I can't use the telephone system, or I can't pay cash for something, or I can't check out the way I want to in a queue at the shop. And somehow you have that sense of loss of control. And that for me is a really concerning thing that policymakers are not engaging with, that sense of agency, which if we don't tackle, I think will be a sort of social void that the far right will take more and more space in. And politically, current policymakers who think they're doing the right thing, being all about economic growth, will actually find that the sort of social impacts of that are inequitably spread, and therefore you will find politically will have significant outcomes for sort of democratic participation and where people feel comfortable the direction of society is taking them. And I don't know what we do well about that. We can keep trying to put these mechanisms in place that fix some of those systems, but will we get policymakers that really want to collectively sit down and say, we are going to take a different path, and we understand this is how these things contribute holistically? And I think the crux of a lot of that is your education system, because it is the core of how individuals are shaped and formed in family life, in school life, in preparation for modern life and society as a whole. And I think if we don't fix that in education, we're really on a downward path at the moment. And I'd like to be optimistic. I don't want to always end things on a sort of downer. We could imagine a different future where you understand what data is collected about you. You know which tools and apps you use. They're always going to be in your best interests, not competing interests with the school to profile you and rank and spank you. They're not in the competing interest of measuring the capacity of the teacher or how good a teacher they are. They're not in the best interest of the system to measure your exams output. They're actually always going to be in your best interest to see, have you learned something? Has it helped you learn the way that you need to learn best? And do you have access to that information? And can you be in control of it? And can you decide to some extent, what it is that your gaps are in your learning and what that might lead to next? And that's a different vision from the current model of personalization that a lot of people see, which is all about sort of scoring and datafication and profiling and the teachers being able to steer things, but really only in the way that the company's systems allow you to. So it's still steered ultimately by the values that the company puts into the system and controls through their design practices and their user experience. And I think we haven't grappled with that. And we've got, different ways we could do that. But we could have a vision which is so much more positive, but it does need some infrastructure and it does need some funding. And we can't leave that to big tech companies who are prepared to do it for free because they see something in it for them. Their business models depend on freeware, or they're happy to give it to you at a low cost. And I think more people have to ask why. What's in it for them? What are they getting out of it? And who's going to control our education system in a few years' time? We could have a really exciting time with better educated, better informed, better savvy, everyday practical skills for everybody of every capability that has the capability and capacity to use some sorts of digital skills, which really is required across so much of society now. Yeah, I could be really, really optimistic about some of that. I just hope there's enough people that, can work towards those things and get them delivered into policy that can make it happen. And it might be incremental. It might be it's not going to happen in the next 5 years and it's bit by bit, but we'll see.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Defend Digital Me are an interesting organisation, so if you want to find out more from them, there's a link in the description. If you want to read more, we've also collaborated with Jen on some articles that you can find on our website at pvcy.org/edtech. There's more to come from our work with her, so keep an eye out. We've been really closely monitoring this kind of trend. And we've been really concerned because a lot of these technologies, a lot of these kind of databases, methods of data extraction and sharing are really familiar to us from other avenues of work, like our government surveillance work and our corporate surveillance work. So seeing them being deployed on children in really sensitive mandatory spaces has been really, really concerning. And so we've got an article that we've done with Jen called Studying Under Surveillance, the Securitization of Learning, and one called The Unavoidable Rise of EdTech in Educational Spaces, which kind of give more of an overview of the specific ways that we're concerned. Then we've got a couple more coming out, one specifically on England and one looking more at the commercialization aspects. We're not the only people raising the alarm, and I realised that conversation was pretty UK specific and maybe a little bit depressing in ways we didn't really mean it to be. So I thought it would be worth maybe sneaking in at the end and talking a bit more about the fact that, like, the alarm is being raised. Among others, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education has called out the adverse impacts of state surveillance visited by EdTech, including the intrusive nature of the technologies, the data collection, the role of commercial entities, and the fact that some technology just shouldn't be deployed in the ways that they have been in the spaces that they have been, like facial recognition technology. If you want to learn more about what we think about that and learn more from our collaboration with Jen, pvcy.org/edtech. Thanks for listening. You can sign up to be the first to learn more about our work at pvcy.org/pod sign up. And we'll include some links to relevant articles and information in the description wherever you're listening or on our website at pvcy.org/techpill. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. Music courtesy of Sepia. Podcast produced by Max Bonnell for Privacy International. Thank you.